Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We have a very interesting show today because we are filming from the FBI headquarters here in Washington, D.C. Certainly a pleasure to be invited to do that. And we have a great topic. We're going to be talking about cyber risk and the board. And joining me as my guest today is Robert Anderson, Jr., who is the Executive Assistant Director of the Criminal Cyber Response and Services Branch of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or as we call it, the FBI. So welcome, Bob.
Glad to be here.
We were lucky enough to have the Counterintelligence Division in, and in that show we were able to talk about the economic espionage and the trade secrets and the intellectual property and that. That isn't as well publicized as what we're going to talk about today with a cyber risk. You can't pick up the paper these days or watch the news without hearing of some kind of cyber breach or state-sponsored activity. So probably the best place for us to start is to sort of lay that groundwork for cyber risk from your perspective. You know, what do you see as the threats on companies today and the challenges sort of that boards have? If you can sort of lay that environment out, that's a great place for us to start.
Sure. I think the best place to start is just tell you how the FBI looks at it and then move into the private sector. And I think why this is a good key topic to start on is 5 years ago, cyber obviously was part of the FBI, and we looked at it thematically across the organization. I can tell you nowadays, 5 years later, cyber permeates every aspect of what the FBI does, both CONUS and OCONUS, internationally or in the United States, both for top secret and secret reasons, and also for the private enterprise. 5 years ago, me sitting down talking to you about why cyber is so important to us in the private enterprise wouldn't have happened. Today, we have meetings on cyber threats, cyber intrusions almost every day. So when you talk about private enterprise, I think one of the major things that any company CEO or boards would want to think about is, do we have a robust, ongoing, fluid cyber program that is constantly watching the evolution of that threat? Because I can tell you, whether it's a criminal actor or a nation state, as you brought up, they constantly are refining their techniques and their skills on how to hack and break into corporations.
I assume that there's national security issues too, like power companies and those type of things as well.
So you're absolutely right. And depending on the nation state, if we're talking about like national security type issues breaking into corporations, they have a variety of ways that they'll do that. And they also, for each state that's trying to do it, they may have a different goal. You brought up, disruptions, DDoS attacks with industries. I mean, it's been widely publicized that Iran has done that for years, both in the papers and in other literature about business. And they do that for a certain reason. There's other countries, as you brought up earlier about when we talk about proprietary and trade secret information, that quite frankly, they think there's nothing wrong with breaking into a company and stealing that information. They think that's business. And then, of course, you have sort of like the lower level, which are organized crime or crime figures that are doing it specifically for money, not necessarily to gain power or information as maybe a nation state, but to either hold your computers ransom or to take infrastructure from your company that they can then sell.
You know, one thing that isn't talked about near as much and probably not as sexy as state-sponsored is internal risk.
Absolutely.
From the employee perspective, when you think of all the devices that are created today, yes, and all the points of entry, and you add to that a disgruntled, employee or something, That's a risk that isn't as well publicized, but is probably as big, or if not bigger, for companies than the outside risk.
You're absolutely right. And I can tell you nowadays, I would advise most CEOs and boards to be looking at, do you have a holistic 360-degree picture of what's valuable to your corporation, right? And that incorporates not only a good incident response capability, a good information assurance capability, and then looking at exactly what you said, the insider threat to our corporation, employees on board that have access and information, and may not even be intentionally trying to violate or lose proprietary information, but because of the way we manipulate it nowadays through cell phones, through emails, through internet transponders, those informations could be stolen or acquired by a bad guy or by a nation state.
So here's the challenge for the boards. Cyber, with its growth as being a threat, is not something that 10 years ago was sort of on the plate for a lot of corporations. It was, but it certainly wasn't identified to be the threat that it is today. Yeah. So a lot of the people that are serving on the board of directors never had this in their experience of coming through the ranks, and now are being called upon, to understand this well enough to decipher and to oversee whether the organizations have the right people in place and processes in place. This sort of creates a challenge, for board members because it's not an expertise of theirs. So what have you been seeing, knowing that this challenge exists, what have you been seeing? How have companies sort of bridged that gap between not knowing but needing to oversee this process? Anything in particular?
Well, I think obviously having a good chief security officer and a chief information officer within the corporation is essential. But I would tell you, I think the companies that I've seen do this and do it really well is they're never happy with the status quo. And what I mean by that is, anytime somebody comes into your office and says, we got this, we got it, I would be concerned, because it's an ever-changing, fluid environment that is changing every day. And that type of dynamic has to be carried through the corporation. In other words, we may have a great handle on our cybersecurity and information assurance today, but we need to have a program that is ever evolving and changing to the threat as it evolves. Bad guys around the world, they don't operate by rules. There's no laws. There's not a constitution. So sometimes because of our bureaucracy, whether government or private enterprise, we just need to make sure that we're constantly evolving with the bad guy's threat. I think if a board of directors or a CEO has people in place or corporations that they employ to help them do this, as long as those people are constantly telling them we're constantly evolving with the threat, that should give them a good base of security.
Talk a little bit about how you guys are approaching this open communications with companies and what's available to companies today that they may not be aware of.
So you're absolutely right. 10 years ago, big challenge. When we'd walk in and say, hey, we're the FBI, we're here to help, that would be a challenging thing. Nowadays, it's kind of an ongoing way of doing business. The private sector, outside the government sector, is quite frankly where all the stuff is that the bad guys want. We have all the information that we're collecting from different sources that can help the private sector keep their company's information secure. So over the years, we developed numerous outreach programs within the organization to include the Business Alliance and other things that we're utilizing. But the biggest thing that any corporation has available to them in any one of the states in the country, the FBI has 56 field offices across the United States. We have 400 resident agencies, which is like basically little offices off of the big offices. We're also in 123 countries abroad with legal attachés. So it's truly a global organization. Each and every one of those offices have the ability to come in, talk at any level of the corporation that the corporation would like. If they want us to come in and talk to the CEO, the president, vice presidents, the boards, we can. If they want us to come in and talk with the CISOs and other officers at certain levels of the company, we can. And we're very willing to share the latest and current information on cyber threats globally that we see. May not be affecting your company now, could affect it later.
Some companies probably don't realize the risks that are inherent in them even doing their business. So you would be hard pressed to believe that there isn't anybody that can't benefit from that visit to at least establish the lines of communication if they're needed in the future.
Totally agree. It's better to talk and meet each other way before a crisis happens so that you know the individuals that you're talking to. And even if one doesn't happen, that open line of communication is a way for you to keep current on all the things that's going on around you and around us in this kind of global society that we live in nowadays.
Well, Bob, thanks again for joining us. I'm sure with our communication of what's available that we'll see some more communication between the companies and the FBI, which certainly will be fruitful. And we appreciate that you took the time to join us today.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure.
And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC, along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.